I would like to thank everybody for being here on behalf of NDSU and the College of Science and Math and the Department of Biological Sciences, among other sponsors that we've had. My name is Dr. Peggy Biga. I'm assistant professor in the Biological Sciences Department at NDSU, for those of you who do not know me. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker for the Science Cafe today, Dr. Genie Scott, who comes to us from Berkeley, California. So it's a little bit colder here for her today. However, she did come here en route from Houston. I think it's probably a little cold for her, but that's all right. I think she's surviving. She is the executive director for the National Center of Science Education, and she started her education out at actually one of my old alma maters, the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, where she received her bachelor's and master's degrees. She received her PhD from the University of Missouri in physical anthropology. And then she moved to the University of Kentucky, where she was an assistant professor, and she also was a professor at the University of Colorado. And in 1987, she became the executive director of the National Center for Science Education. And one of the three overarching missions of the National Center for Science Education, it's a lot of words, are introducing people and educating people about all over the world about evolution and creation, the controversy about teaching evolution, as well as introducing how important learning science is for knowing and knowledge. And it is my great pleasure to introduce her today for the Science Cafe to talk to us about the evolution of creationism. So please, let's welcome Dr. Scott.
Thank you. It's a lot of fun to be here. I was joking around on my Facebook update, and I said, I'm in Fargo. And one of my Facebook friends said, you went to Fargo in February on purpose? I said, yeah, these people have a great Darwin Day. You ought to have a really great Darwin Day too. And I put a link into the website, so there. Actually, I grew up in Wisconsin, so I'm not that much of a hothouse flower. I just pretend. I kind of did lose some of my cold chops, being in California this one, but I'm delighted to be here. And the snow really is pretty, especially falling as it is here. Okay, I'm going to tell you about the evolution of creationism, where we were, where we were in the past, where we are in the recent past, where we are today, all of which is very interesting, and you really can understand where we are today until you know where we were in the past. So clearly history is a very important thing for understanding the present, in my opinion. And as is so often the case in my line of work, we will start in the beginning. In the beginning, we'll start, of course, with the Scopes trial. That's not the absolute beginning, but at least it's close enough for our purposes. I'm sure you're all familiar with the trial of John T. Scopes in 1925. Tennessee had passed the Butler Act, which forbade the teaching of human evolution in Tennessee schools, and Dayton, Tennessee decided to challenge this law. And John Scopes may or may not have actually taught evolution, but nonetheless he was put on trial for having done so. William Jennings Bryan on the right and Clarence Darrow on the left, the two most famous legal figures of their day, battled in an incredible trial, very poorly memorialized, by the way, in the play and movie Inherit the Wind. Inherit the Wind is an excellent play, but it has very little to do with the Scopes trial. If you really want to know about the Scopes trial, you should actually read a very good book by the lawyer and historian Ed Larson called Summer of the Gods. The real Scopes trial was even more gripping than the movie, so to speak, the play that was loosely based upon it. But rather than getting into the details of the Scopes trial, what we can really learn from the Scopes trial is how some things have really not changed a whole lot. Bryan made three main arguments in the Scopes trial. He argued that evolution was unsupported science. Scientists were giving up on evolution. It was weak science. It wasn't really supported by the data. He argued that evolution was incompatible with religion, that if you were a good Christian, I'm going to move this because I'm finding I'm facing more to the right, which means that my voice is going to drop when I do that. He argued that you were either a good Christian or you could accept evolution, and that there was this dichotomous choice that had to be made. And finally, he argued that citizens, not experts, should determine the curriculum. He who pays the piper calls the tune. And since citizens were the ones that paid the school teachers, they could decide what it was, what should be taught. Whether they knew anything about math and history or science or not, they still could decide what was to be taught. And if they didn't think evolution should be taught, then by golly, evolution was not going to be taught. When I read this in Ed Larson's book, I was struck by how at NCSE we often refer to the pillars of creationism, which are the three arguments that if you read the creationist literature, you will find commonly expressed in books and movies and letters to the editor and creationist sources. And this is that evolution is a theory in crisis, that scientists are giving up on evolution, it's not supported by the data. You will find the argument made that evolution and religion are incompatible, that you have to choose between faith and science, between Christianity and evolution. And you will find a variant of Brian's third argument, that it's only fair to teach creationism with evolution, that if you teach evolution, you should balance evolution with something else. As I'll try to illustrate, originally the idea was that you could teach evolution, but you should balance it with the teaching of creationism. And then, given some legal decisions, well, teach evolution, but balance it with the teaching of something called creation science. And then, after some court decisions, the argument was made that you should teach evolution, but balance it with the teaching of intelligent design. And nowadays, I'm giving you a preview of coming attractions here, nowadays we hear, we'll teach evolution, but balance it with the arguments against evolution, with the evidence against evolution. So we're dealing with a lot of the same kinds of things that we're dealing with in 1925. That was a long time ago. In order to understand the past and present of the creationism and evolution controversy, you need to know, you need to have a little brush up, shall we say, about the First Amendment, because the legal decisions do bear very strongly upon our Constitution, or lean upon our Constitution. Remember in the Bill of Rights, the first clause of the Bill of, the first of the amendments to the Constitution, the first part of that First Amendment is the religion part, and it has two components, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Now taken together, the Establishment and Free Exercise Clauses mean that government institutions, and that includes education, schools, government institutions have to be religiously neutral. You can neither advance nor inhibit religion. You cannot promote religion, you cannot restrict religion. That's what establishment and free exercise mean. You have to be religiously neutral. And that has worked really well in our country for a long time. We don't have a Taliban here. We don't have a theocracy. We don't have a government that restricts religion. We don't have a government that establishes religion. It's a really good thing that we have the First Amendment. Many nations around the world are quite envious of that aspect of our Constitution. It's something we should really cherish. So keep the Establishment and Free Exercise Clauses in mind, because we'll be talking about them off and on during this discussion. Now, John Scopes taught from a book called Civic Biology, written by a man named Hunter. And Hunter's book included evolution, as did most books published around the turn of the century, interestingly enough. After the Scopes trial, however, evolution disappeared from the textbooks of the time. Scopes lost, and the textbook publishers decided that it was just easier to drop evolution than it was to fight the battles of trying to get modern science into the textbooks in the face of public opposition to the teaching of evolution, primarily in southern states. There wasn't appreciable opposition in the north, not very much anyway, And clearly evolution was taught at the university level, but evolution pretty much disappeared from the high school level from about 1930 on. And it really didn't appear back in the high school curriculum until the Sputnik era. In the late 1950s, the Soviets, of course, sent up the satellite Sputnik, which, for those of us who were there and remember, was a real shock to the American psyche. The communists had beaten the American democracy into space, and this was something that was very difficult for us to handle as a nation, because we were the greatest country in the world, and the Ruskies had beaten us to space. They sent up the first satellite. So what happened was the new National Science Foundation started investing very heavily in scientific research and also in science education. And one of the things that the National Science Foundation did was fund the writing and publication of some model textbooks in physics, chemistry, earth science, and biology. And the way these textbook committees were assembled, they took university-level scientists and master teachers from high school and middle school and elementary school. And they put these people together and locked them in a room for 6 months, so to speak. And they came up with these really great modern textbooks that actually had accurate science in them. And when the biology textbook committee finished writing their books, they basically took a look at the books that were extant and threw them out and just wrote from scratch. The books included evolution, they included ecology, they included human reproduction. They included all the things that the textbooks had not included up until that point. And of course, since these books were very popular, the commercial publishers started to clone them, so evolution came back into the textbooks by about the late 60s and the early 70s. Now, what this caused was a problem for the state of Arkansas, because the state of Arkansas had still on its books one of these Scopes-era anti-evolution laws. The textbooks had evolution in them, but Arkansas had books that required the teaching of evolution. And the Arkansas Education Association decided that it would challenge these laws in what it thought would be just sort of a little housekeeping kind of lawsuit. And a young 25-year-old biology teacher named Susan Epperson was chosen as the plaintiff. She was an Arkansas native. She was an articulate young lady whose father was a biology teacher. And besides that, she and her Air Force husband were going to be leaving the state, so any possible repercussions would not be permanent. So she was a good, safe plaintiff for this case. Well, imagine Susan and everybody else's surprise when, instead of just being a little housekeeping matter to get rid of a silly law that everybody thought was kind of dopey and nobody was paying any attention to, this law went all the way to the Supreme Court. And Epperson versus Arkansas in 1968 was a Supreme Court decision that struck down Scopes-type, thou shalt not teach evolution type of laws. Susan Epperson is alive and well. She is a chemistry teacher in Colorado Springs. Her daughter, Elaine Epperson, is a PhD biologist, and like all biologists, an evolutionary biologist. Her son, Mark Epperson, is a ordained Presbyterian minister. This clearly is a family that does not have a problem with science and religion. But bringing evolution back into the textbooks, and therefore back into the high school curriculum, helped to generate the second wave, shall we say, of the anti-evolution movement, which is the creation science movement. Now, creation science is largely the production of this man, Henry Morris, who founded the Institute for Creation Research in Southern California. Currently, the ICR is in Dallas, Texas. And Morris is, in my opinion, the most important creationist of the 20th century, much more important than Darwin, for example. He almost single-handedly invented this field, and basically the kinds of ideas that he set forth have been widely spread by others and added to by others. Creation science is basically the idea of taking a pretty much literal Genesis view of special creation, which I'll describe in a moment, and claiming that there is scientific evidence to support it. Now, special creationism is a type of Christian theology which claims that obviously God created, because all Christians believe God created. But special creationism is a specific claim about how God created. And in special creationism, God creates everything in its present form. So in special creationism, if you look out and you see the solar system with the planets, and you look at the galaxy, the Milky Way, and you look at all the other galaxies, and you look at the plants and animals on Earth, that's how God created them during the week of creation, as described in Genesis. When speaking of plants and animals, special creationism argues, as does the Bible, that God created plants and animals as specifically created kinds. Kind is not really defined in creationist usage. It's not a species. It's sort of a higher taxonomic level than that. You can have variation within the kind, but a kind is maybe like a family level. So you could have a cat kind, and a cat kind would include tigers and lions and bobcats and cougars and house cats and animal felidae, basically. Or you might have an antilopidae, an antelope kind. So you would have specially created kinds. The cat kind and the dog kind did not have a common carnivore ancestor. Kinds are separately created. Creationists often use the analogy of blades of grass as opposed to the evolutionist tree. Actually, more recent creationists have talked about the creationist orchard, where you have a separate creation, and then within the kind you might have branching, just like a tree would have branches. But you don't have a tree like an evolutionist views a tree, where lots of living things have common ancestors, which of course is what evolution is all about. The most common kind of special creationism is the kind associated with Henry Morris's movement, which is young earth creationism. And usually everything is created at one time during the 6 24-hour days of creation as described in Genesis. But the most important aspect of special creationism is the idea of creation of everything in its present form, which is why those of us who are students of the movement would include something like intelligent design as a form of special creationism. Because if you read, and I'll talk in more detail about intelligent design, but when I get to it, please remember this point. In intelligent design, complex biological structures, such as the bacterial flagellum or the blood clotting cascade or some of these other complex molecular structures or anatomical structures like the eye, are said to be incapable of evolution. They have to occur, all of their parts have to be put together at one time. That is, in fact, a special creation kind of model. Now, in the creationist literature, they talk about the two-model approach, in which there are only two possibilities. There's either evolution or there's special creationism. And the argument is made that if you just disprove evolution, then special creationism wins by default. And I would suggest to you that this is actually only acceptable logic if there are no other possibilities on the left-hand side of that diagram. But of course there are. Special creationism, as I mentioned, is only one form of Christian theology. In fact, a much more widespread form of Christian theology is something called theistic evolution, which is the view that evolution happened and it was the way God chose to bring the world and the universe into its present form. Theistic evolution is what you learned if you went to Catholic schools. I often joke that if you want to learn evolution, you may be better off going to a Catholic school than to a public school, because at least in the Catholic school, you're guaranteed to be taught evolution. You're not guaranteed to be taught it in a public school. But theistic evolution is accepted by Catholics and most mainstream Protestants. But we shouldn't just be, fixated on Christianity, because Christianity is not the only religion on the planet. We shouldn't just be wedded to our own most familiar religion. There are many world religions, there are tribal religions, there are religions of ancient peoples that are no longer extant. There are lots of different religions around the world, past and present, and they all have views of origins. If you disprove evolution, you do not prove them true any more than you prove special creation true. So the logic of this two-model approach simply fails if you are aware of all of these other possibilities. But I will be coming back to this two-model approach because it does run all the way through the past and the present circumstances of the creation and evolution controversy. Well, during the 1970s and early 1980s, there were lots of efforts to get creation science taught in local schools, but also efforts to try to get state laws passed that required that if you taught evolution, you also had to teach creation science to balance it out. Over 24 states had legislation of this kind introduced, but only 2 states passed such legislation. One of these states was the state of Arkansas, and another state was the state of Louisiana. Louisiana was a case, the Louisiana law actually went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Arkansas law did not. There's an interesting story of the Arkansas law, but the Louisiana law is in one sense more important because it actually became precedent for the whole nation. In Edwards, the Supreme Court struck down equal time for creation science laws. And in the Edwards decision, the justices made, I think, a very good point that I'd like to read to you. Justice Brennan wrote, "Thus the act is designed either to promote the theory of creation science that embodies a particular religious tenet, or to prohibit the teaching of a scientific theory disfavored by certain religious sects. In either case, the act violates the First Amendment." This is the bottom line. Public schools have to be religiously neutral. They cannot favor one religious view over another, nor favor religion over non-religion. Equal time for creation science laws, such as those passed in Louisiana and Arkansas, did exactly this, and that is why the Supreme Court struck them down. I'll be coming back to Edwards versus Arkansas, so kind of keep that in your peripheral frontal lobe or wherever you keep such things. But even before the 1987 Edwards decision, a group of conservative Christians were not terribly happy with creation science. They could see that it had legal vulnerabilities, but also because creation science was so dependent upon biblical literalism and a young earth and an actual historical Noah's flood, which mainstream Christianity doesn't really embrace, particularly the young earth aspects. They were looking for a way to promote anti-evolutionism, if you will, other than creation science. And the book that's on the top of this stack, and there's a whole series of books that were written during this period of about 1980 to about 1986 or 7, The Mystery of Life's Origin is considered the most successful of these books in forming what became the intelligent design movement. In The Mystery of Life's Origin, the topic of the origin of life was tackled, and certainly the origin of life is a very difficult scientific issue. It is absolutely the case that scientists do not have agreement upon a step-by-step procedure from which you go from inorganic chemicals to organic chemicals to something that reproduces within a membrane to something that looks like a cell. We've got little bits and pieces of this along the way, but we don't have agreement for a whole sweet series. We've got a lot of cool stuff, but indeed, it's a very tough problem. In The Mystery of Life's Origin, the argument of the authors was not that this is a tough problem. The argument was this is an unsolvable problem. They argued that there existed a class of scientific problems that wasn't just difficult, but that were unsolvable. Which, when you think about it, is not quite the way most scientists think about scientific problems. Most scientists would think, this is a really tough problem. We might might not have the tools or the instrumentation or the theory to deal with it right now. Maybe we will in 5 years or 20 years or 50 years. We'll set it aside maybe, or we'll just keep working on it. But I don't know any scientist who's willing to say, too tough, chuck it out. That's just not the way scientists do things. But that was the basic argument of mystery of life's origin. This is an unsolvable problem. And the reason why it was unsolvable is because by its own nature of its terrific complexity, that the incredible complexity of that first replicating cell, it was impossible to explain without intelligence. Dean Kenyon in the foreword wrote, "It is fundamentally implausible that unassisted matter and energy organize themselves into living systems." Now, this of course sounds familiar to anybody who knows anything about the history of science. This is very similar to what William Paley was talking about in his very famous 1802 book, Natural Theology. He's the guy with the heath. Remember the heath? You see a rock on the heath, you don't think twice about it, might have been there for millions of years. You see a watch on the heath, and you know that is very unusual. The watch consists of all of these pieces and parts that are put together to provide the purpose of telling time. It's got wires and springs and glass and metal and all this stuff. So you see something that's structurally complex like a watch, you know there had to be a watchmaker, obviously. Then, said Paley, you see something like the vertebrate eye, which is so very complicated. It's got layers, and it's got lines, and it's got lenses, and it's got all of these different pieces, all these parts that are fit together to bring light into the brain and form an image. No way that something like that could have been just the result of chance, any more than a watch could just be the result of chance. When you see something that's structurally complex in nature like the vertebrate eye, you know that that's evidence for a designer. You know there had to be a God. That was Paley's watchmaker analogy. And his book, Natural Theology, is a lovely book. It's full of wonderful natural history. It's really quite a pleasure to read, actually. And it was an apologetic. It was an argument for the existence of God. And Darwin read it, and he thought it was a great book. Everybody in Darwin's day read it. It was considered a great book. Darwin read it as a student. When Darwin grew up, and he developed his idea of evolution through natural selection, this was the idea that basically replaced the idea of God's special design in the sense of God specially creating things de novo, as it were, like the vertebrate eye. What Darwin did was Darwin came up with a non-chance, natural way of producing complex structures. No biologist, no evolutionary biologist on this planet says that the vertebrate eye or the bacteria flagellum or any other complex structure is the result of chance. Earth to, Genie to Earth. Evolution is not a chance process. Natural selection is not a chance process, okay? Truly, trust me on this one. Natural selection is adaptive differential reproduction. It is not a chance process. And what Darwin did was come up with a natural way of explaining how you can get really complicated things in nature that didn't require God having to go zap. And that was the thing that was so shocking about origin of species. More than the idea of common ancestry. It was the idea of replacing the argument from design. And if we had time to talk about that, I'd love to, but we don't. We will talk about creationism instead. So, in my opinion, and that of many other people who have studied the creation and evolution controversy, the intelligent design set of ideas really is a subset of creation science, which is to say that although there are claims made in creation science, about the claims made by creation science proponents, such as about the young Earth or Noah's flood creating the surface of the planet geologically or cutting Grand Canyon or whatever. There are claims made by creation science proponents that tend not to be made by intelligent design proponents. Nonetheless, all of the claims made by intelligent design proponents pre-existed in creation science. The design argument is really what intelligent design is all about. And it is fully pre-existent within the creation science movement. Now, I always like to let proponents define the terms. And I'm going to let William Dembski define intelligent design because he's one of the major intelligent design spokespeople. William Dembski defines intelligent design this way. He says it's a scientific research program that investigates the effects of intelligent causes, an intellectual movement that challenges Darwinism and its naturalistic legacy, and a way of understanding divine action. Well, however interesting these two might be to theologians or religious people, the only one that really is a scientific idea is the first one, and that's the one I'm going to deal with tonight. So let's look and see whether intelligent design succeeds as a scientific research program that investigates the effects of intelligent causes. When you look at the scientific claim,